Welcome back, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today with Anna Leahy and Claudine Jaenichen, editors of Tab Journal. And we are experiencing some technical difficulties, which I actually find hilarious and awesome, which is that Claudine is upside down. So as always, those of you in the chat, in the audience, thank you for coming out. If you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat and I'll work them into the conversation. And if you have any technical advice for how to get Claudine right side up again, we are open to it. Can you turn on captions? That is a good question. And I actually, if someone wants to advise me as to how to do that, apologies, I've not turned on captions for Zoom before.
I think it's connected to your ability to turn on the recording.
Oh, okay. So, all right, let me pause this. The video will be posted on YouTube afterward, and I know with YouTube you can watch it again with captions, so apologies to anyone who has trouble following along. I don't see an option to do captions now, but when you watch it later you will be able to watch it with captions. So again, thanks all for coming out. And Claudine's going to turn off our video. So let's jump right in. Tab Journal, it's an online journal for poetry and poetics. And I know you have a strong visual focus, which is also funny and ironic that, you know, we're having these visual challenges. But so, and actually you guys just had your 10th issue just came out.
So it's not actually out yet. We just saw it yesterday, but yes, this is the first time anybody can publicly see it. And here it is.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Shiny.
Yeah.
And we do something different every January. So we launch every year with a print issue. And as you can see, it's got great big pages, and these poems tend to have visual elements.
Right.
And Claudine can talk a little bit more about the design of this particular issue, but one of the reasons that it is not out already, usually we send it out in the second week of January, but because of the pandemic, we had paper shortage issues, so that ran late. And then this is actually a big poster that we have to fold. So we're in the process of folding now, and these will probably go out to what we call subscribers, but we send them to every contributor ever, whether you contributed to a print issue or an online issue. And that's how we build the mailing list. And it's sort of a gift, because we're currently not paying contributors, but they get this sort of lifetime subscription to the journal. And maybe Claudine can talk a little bit more about the design of this issue, because we really select the content and the design in tandem and go back and forth as we start building the poems and changing the design.
Yeah. Oh, Anna, can you hold it up one more time? Because it's super, I just want to point out, this is printed 2-color, black and metallic. And so the shininess is not just from the paper, from the coating of the paper, it's actually a metallic ink. And
wow.
Yeah, so it's hard to tell on screen, but 10th anniversary, the 10th anniversary, we're looking at silver, we're looking at the annual, you know, the gifting that happens in the 10th year anniversary. It's also interesting because last year, we were in the midst of COVID. We hadn't quite gotten super slammed with budget cuts yet, right, Anna? We still had, we work with a limited budget, and part of our collaboration is constraint. And that's one of the things, this one probably had the biggest budget constraint. So we really had to strip down the amount of color. So in printing, you can print 4-color, you can print, 1 color like black and white. So the way we kind of get around these things is when Anna folded it out, that's a standard press sheet, 24 by 36. We've used that standard almost the majority of our journals, but they all look completely different. So we're trying to find ways, creative, innovative ways to use a standard size and create new experiences for the print issue. And so that's why we do the folding. That's part of it, is the design, the budget constraint is we can't afford to do that. So we take it in-house, and we actually are very intimate and tactile with the, I feel like these are pieces of a human experiences also being delivered, you know, to these subscribers. Is we actually got to touch every single, a human hand touched every single one, unfolding these together.
Yeah, I
That's
think
really
we do really think of that as an art object. And I also just want to say that I have some design background, but I think most editors of journals do not think about, okay, when we have a journal page size, what does that actually mean in production? And as Claudine pointed out, we're actually thinking about, okay, what's the actual paper size that the printer is starting with? And what can we do with that? So we're thinking about design and space in very different ways than most journals.
Yeah, it reminds me of that phrase, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So it sounds like you had this challenge of budget cuts and you found this really innovative way to actually physically design the journal to get around that.
Indeed. And the budget is always, I think, always our first constraint. So before Claudine even thinks about what the design can be, she asks me what the budget is. And the budget has been pretty standard. I don't think it's gone up since we started this 10 years ago. And we share the budget between the journal and the reading series. And part of the reason we were able to produce a print issue this time was that the reading series was scaled back, and the dean's office helped with that because of the budget cuts.
So the magazine is affiliated with Chapman University, is that correct?
Correct, yes. Chapman University, and underneath that, Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences.
Okay.
Which is great because, you know, English is technically a humanities department, but I'm in creative writing, which is the arts, and Claudine is in the art department as a graphic designer and an informational designer, but we're both in the same college, so we have a lot of interaction.
That's really cool. I'm surprised there actually isn't more collaboration among art professors and literature professors in other literary magazines. It seems like there's a great opportunity there.
I think it's huge. Go ahead, Claudine.
You know, one of the things that I really try to champion is the real activity of collaborations. And it's not where one field is servicing the other. I think it's very easy to get caught up in, oh, I'm a designer, let me design the content after you've done thinking about it. And there's a lot of confusion. I don't think that's collaboration. I think that's just one specialty servicing the other, right? They still stay in their lanes. The thing about Anna and I's 10 years of collaborating is we truly are in each other's business. Like when I get too scared with design, Anna has numerous times pushes me over the edge and saying, Claudine, go for that design. So she gives me the confidence in my field, and I participate in reviewing the submissions on the poetry. Like there's really this amazing synergy. And I don't know, if I wish there was more of that, even within the art department. And I don't know if, Anna, if this is the same for you in English, it's hard to see collaborations. And it should be done so much more than it is now. But I think it's the idea of how you'd go about it, and truly, I think this work is my creative scholarship. The ownership of it, it's not just me servicing it. And so if there could be more thought about and more value in that, I think we would see more of that, because oh my gosh, it's been so fun as well. Like it's my best work, some of my best work, and also just this amazing experience that I get to have.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that Tab, the way we have produced Tab is something that neither one of us could have done on our own. And so to me, collaboration allows you to do more than you can do on your own. But I agree with Claudine. I think it's hard to collaborate across disciplines, especially in universities, even though we're all here in the same larger space. There is a tendency to stay in your lane. And especially with creative writing, I think there's so much a focus on individual authorship that collaboration can be, I don't know that the people know how to do it very well. I think some people do it extraordinarily well, but that sort of points out the larger landscape that is very individualistic. And I'm so glad that Tab is not that way. And, you know, I don't accept poems for the print issue until Claudine has seen them and said, I like this one better than this one, and this one's going to fit on the page this way, and this one is going to fit on the page this way. What do you think about how that looks, and how do these poems look together? So I do think it's a really exciting, dynamic, fun relationship.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys have any connection to Cal Arts? Because I think of their program as sort of experimental and sort of interested in the visual arts and literature, kind of, and how they tie together.
We have had some undergrads in creative writing go there for their MFA, and I think it is a very experimental place, but Claudine may know more about that.
I received my undergrad there. So I know. Yeah, so so I can't speak to the literature part, the writing program, but the graphic design program is super ritual and experimental and opposite of what I would say Chapman's graphic design program is. But this is what I call my Cal Arts work. This is the where I reach back into my undergrad years. I'm like, oh, think the playing. It's a lot of play and experimental and trusting intuition rather than being so methodical and analytical about every process. So yes, very much influenced, at least for my process, by my Cal Arts experience.
And so what input do you have from students? Is this a student run magazine, or is it just you two kind of at the helm, or how are students involved?
So we have evolved this over the years. One thing that Claudine and I talked about even before we put out the first issue was how to involve students. And we decided that we need to figure out the collaboration before we bring students into the mess. And so for the first couple of years, it was basically Claudine and myself. And we were also constrained at that time by an online platform for our electronic issues called OJS, Open Journal Systems. And it was, the university approved this project based on us using that system. And it was cool because it was very different than any other literary journal was doing. It's designed for scholarly journals, but it was so clunky for submissions, and the screen worked differently. It's really seamless in other ways. But that also made it hard to bring staff in as readers because it was set up for peer review in a very different way. So after those first couple of years, we started working with MFA students. Now our staff consists of myself and Claudine at sort of the helm, and then Brian Glazer, my colleague in English, who I think just had his 4th poetry book published. He's the criticism editor, and he's really interested in echo poetics right now, and DEI takes, diversity, equity, and inclusion takes on poetry and contemporary literary culture. We instituted a communications coordinator for the first time this year, and that's been great. So follow us on Twitter. We also have a Facebook presence. We're doing a much better job with that, and we're developing the blog, the Tab Musings blog, this year, and we've got a bunch of things lined up for that. So I think that's giving students more experience. Then we have a slew of MFA alums and current students who are staff. They do the submissions reading, and then they also write the book reviews. So we do run poetry book reviews, and all those are written in-house so that our MFA students get experience with that. But we welcome, if you want to send new books that are coming out in 2022, I'll be assigning book reviews in the next several weeks. So anyone can send us a copy, either PDF to my email, or we do like hard copies, but the pandemic has made hard copies and mail a much different experience.
Yeah.
That's sort of the way the staff is structured. And also last year we were awarded a grant from the Poetry Foundation, and we've been able to add 2 contributing editors this year to help us really expand our engagement and work on inclusion a little bit more overtly, I guess. And Lynn Thompson is one of the contributing editors. She has been to Chapman before several times. She's the poet laureate of Los Angeles. And then Ruben Quesada is the other contributing editor, and he's worked on a whole bunch of different journals. Oh, there's Lynn in the audience. Anyway, I'm really excited about the role of contributing editors, and I hope we can maintain that, because I see out there in the poetry world, you know, DEI is all the buzz in literary culture. And I think these are really serious issues. And I'm seeing a lot of, you know, one-off guest editors. And that doesn't really change the culture of the journal. And when we make a change, so every year, Claudine and I sit down and say, okay, what are we doing with this print issue, and how do we want to use that to change the project, to keep the project evolving? And I think one-off guest editors is not the answer to systemic, sustainable. In for 6 months, and the 6 months is basically to sync with the July, September, and November issues. And we're still going to have the MFA staff reading submissions. But then when it comes to decision making, it's going to be a collaborative decision between Lynn and Ruben and Claudine and myself, so that I'm not the sole gatekeeper, and we can really talk about how we're reading submissions, what the submission pool is looking like. We're adding demographic questions. Submissions are going to open next week, February 1st. So I think this is an exciting next step for us. I think we've always worked on inclusion and equity, and you know, I think most overtly it's evident in our low vision standards, but I think there's all sorts of ways we need to keep changing how we're doing things in literary culture.
For sure. And I see Claudine is right side up again. So
Feel better.
So this is sort of a weird question, but your magazine just seems incredibly cool. And I'm wondering what you do for outreach, because it's not like I don't see the journal's name pop up that frequently. And it seems very deserving of more recognition, because it's clearly doing something that's unique and exciting. And I love interdisciplinary stuff. I love this collaboration between literature and the visual arts, and that, you know, there's special attention to visual disparities and the full, you know, poster fold out, and, you know, all this cool stuff. So do you feel that frustration too? Like, oh, we should be out there more, or are you sort of, are you finding more of a following that maybe on the West Coast I'm just not familiar with? So what's going on with the outreach there?
So I think that's a really complex question, because literary culture is so vibrant, and I'm finding literary journals mostly through social media that I had never heard of, that have been around as long as Tab. So I think there's a lot of sort of niche culture going on, and the pandemic has opened that up in new ways, particularly because of online events like this, and all these online readings that are free and, you know, at various times of day, because now we're working across time zones. So, you know, if I have, if there's an East Coast reading, then I can take a break in the afternoon and attend that. And so I think that's exciting for literary culture more broadly. In terms of Tab, I think the first couple of years, it was like, well, is this going to work? And I'll be honest, the budget constrains the kinds of engagement that we can do. And we do have a presence at AWP. The pandemic has interrupted that, but we distributed hundreds of copies at AWP prior to the pandemic. And we do plan to be at AWP this year, but we decided not to have a booth because there's so much up in the air. So we need to rethink that, that kind of engagement and getting Tab into the hands of readers. Switching our presence from that old OJS system to a website has changed the scope and the discoverability. So I think we really need to think in terms of engagement on the one hand, and what kinds of audiences we are missing and need to draw in, and the contributing editors are part of that effort. And then the other thing is, you know, how do we make Tab more discoverable? And that's why we've added this communications coordinator position, and we're sort of trying to research best practices and develop new ways to connect with readers. I do think it's important that we are solely focused on poetry, because I think that's a little bit different than journals who do all sorts of genre work. And also, I think we have to think about how to engage the critical part too, because that's tricky. And I think that's a place that we could actually grow Tab in terms of content and a different kind of audiences to really strengthen the criticism part.
So we actually haven't even covered what you actually publish on the literature front. So there's, and I'm curious about, because I see this poetry and poetics, and I've never actually asked an editor what poetics is. So can you clarify that word?
So I chose that word just to try to indicate all things poetry. If it has to do with poetry, we want to take a look at it. We always judge content in relation to design. So even our online issue, the design is designed for the screen. And now we're talking about different kinds of screens. And so not every poem is designed in a way that is fitting for Tab. So even if it's a marvelous poem, we're also judging it in terms of our own design. So aesthetics means more than just the poetry aesthetics. And then in terms of the criticism, we've done a lot of reaching out to specific people, and Brian Glazer, the criticism editor, is working on a plan to do more of that. The book reviews, I think, are also an important part of what we publish, but of course we write those in-house. And I think that this may be just me, but I think book reviews are a really important tradition in literary criticism. And I'd like to talk more about that with other editors and think about why we're doing book reviews and what that is saying about this moment in literary culture, because that's sort of a record of what's happening in literary culture that's different than the original work itself. So poetics to me, in this context, is anything that has to do with poetry, we want to take a look at.
Right. That's interesting. So do you think the book reviews are more of a record than the creative work?
No, but they're a record of this moment
Mhm.
in a different way
Yeah.
than the creative work is. So the
Yeah.
creative work is read in different moments.
Right.
And the book reviews, I think, in my mind, are a tracking of the reading in this moment.
Mhm.
And Claudine and I talk a lot about TAB as a reading experience. And I think that book reviews are documentation or witnessing of a reading experience.
Oh. That's really interesting. I think also it makes sense for reviews because the reviewer is also providing context for the book, right? So the
Right.
literary context, artistic context, socio-political context in a way that a poem isn't. A poem just is itself, right?
And I also think it's a really great mode for MFA students. One of our recent alums, Sam Rizek, wrote an article for Writer's Digest about her experience writing book reviews. She started, I think, in the aspects of a writer class that I teach for all our MFA students. And then she's written for TAB, but she's also written for Los Angeles Review of Books. She's now pitching interviews, and she's really, it makes sense for young writers to be writing book reviews as part of their learning process. So young writers or emerging writers of any age are reading a lot. And the book reviews are ways that they can document for themselves what they're thinking in terms of aesthetics, the literary landscape, and so on. So it makes particular sense to me to have MFA students engaging in that kind of critical work. But I think it's important in terms of literary history to have that record of the reading experience.
So anything related to publishing, poetry. So you publish poems, of course, reviews, interviews with poets.
Yes, in fact, we have a marvelous interview. It's actually a conversation essay between Tryphena Yaboa, who is on TAB still, and was an MFA student here, and another writer that is in the same chapbook series as she is. We got an interview with 5 visual poets set for the March issue. And I think that's a really exciting area too. I think visual poetry is exploding. You know, we're now seeing Poetry Magazine embracing that. So I think that we're doing targeted interviews, and we do welcome interview pitches or interview submissions from anybody, from the wider public. And we also have our staff doing some of those interviews.
And for the poetry, how would you describe the poetry that you're looking for? I know editors always struggle with this question. They surprise us, we like everything. But how would you, if you could summarize it, how would you describe it?
So when we embarked on this, I was very deliberate about saying we need to use the first several issues, and it has continued since then, to establish a really wide range. I don't want somebody to pick up an issue of TAB and say, oh, I know what a TAB poem is. So I really purposefully established a wide range, I hope, early on. And I think we've continued to do that. I'd be curious to hear what Claudine says about what she thinks our poetic aesthetic is, because, you know, I do poetry all the time. And so I take a lot for granted. And that's part of the reason to bring in contributing editors who are really part of the ongoing conversation, is because I'm taking for granted so much of the way I look at poems. But I wonder if Claudine has anything to say about the range of poetry.
You know, I remember at the beginning, it was a wide cast. It was just as much diversity in all sense of that word. But as maybe in the last 5 years or so, I think the way we've sort of started, Anna and I were talking yesterday about curation, curating to a theme, and not a cliche literal interpretation, but you know, like last year we looked at COVID, and we were looking at the concept of time, the you know, time warping, time stopping, you know, and so I would look at these poems or these submissions as how does it fit into the concept? So I think as it's still a wide range as far as aesthetics and how they read. It also has that page, you know, depending on what the format is, that we have word counts and things like that. But we've gotten more focused, at least in the last couple of years, on how it fits in an overall theme, overall package, an overall experience, even though it's still very diverse within that. That's what I've noticed most in that kind of trajectory of the last 10 years.
Yeah, I would agree with that, whether it's the print issue or a particular online issue, that we're trying to create a conversation across poems rather than look at a particular kind of poem or define things too narrowly. So this idea of a loose theme or a conversation that the poems can have, even though they may be very different or they may have unexpected similarities.
And just to emphasize that more, this still makes me nervous just because it's out of the tradition, but even because having that conversation across poems, across content, we do this intentionally. There's 2 issues. This last one, that this 10th anniversary issue, where we don't put the author's name right under the poem. Traditionally, you get the poem, you get the author. It really engages like who wrote this poem. They have to look at a figure number, at a what do you call that? A mineral. I use the ID of mineral. They have to open it up and then kind of find out. But as they're finding out, they're reading other ones. And so it's really a physical, we've done this twice. It still makes me nervous because of the traditions of, you know, content and poems and authorship. But it really does push for that engagement cross-platform, cross-content, and, you know, looking at other things as you're looking for that one thing. So
I will say that makes me nervous too. Because, you know, what are the authors going to say when, you know, you open it up and you see Play Gear and it's like, oh, who wrote Play Gear? Nobody knows. But there's this little tag here, and then you actually have to open it up to see the back and then match the tags with the contributor notes on the back of the poster. So it's a way to highlight the poems and have the poems talking with each other, but it's sort of a weird forced collaboration among the contributors that they may not know they've gotten into. And we always include attribution, but it's not the easiest attribution of the traditional format.
Have you gotten any pushback for it?
Well, nobody has seen this issue yet. We'll see.
Issue 3, we did a map, an old style freeway map. Remember those old fold out maps where they had to match the legend. So B13, they had to flip the map over and match B13. And that's where the author notes, the bio would be. So we did that in issue 3. I don't remember getting any pushback on that one. And I do believe poets are just as creative and experimental. So maybe that was my hope, that we didn't hear anything. But we have tried that an issue in the 3rd year, and so that we haven't done it again since this 10th year anniversary.
And so the nervousness, does it come from, sorry to cut you off, and I'm just curious if you're worried that writers are not going to like it or readers are not going to like it?
So I'll answer that with the time I was the most nervous ever. Let me see if I can find the poem. So our 2nd issue was our most complicated design in many ways, and it folds out in various ways. It's really hard to get through this issue. It's a challenge.
Wow. So wait, can you hold that up again? That is an issue of a journal?
and then it folds out this way. So it is readable, but it keeps, you have to unfold it one piece at a time. And there's one poem in here by C.K. Williams. I don't know if you can see that.
Mhm.
And when it came back, I was like, oh my gosh, it looks like we ran over his poem with a bicycle. It's like bicycle tracks across his poem. And I was so nervous that he would think it was terrible, but he loved it. So
Yeah, it looks cool.
I think we do something so cool
Mhm.
that if it makes poets or readers uncomfortable, they're like, well, that's so cool. Maybe it's about me. That's my hope. But we have had no complaints, and everyone who sees our designs is
Mhm.
pretty impressed.
Mhm.
And I mean, even yesterday when I saw the first copy, I was like, wow, we did that. I can't believe that. It turned out much better than I expected.
Yeah, and I see Claudine's comment here that it's a sculpture piece, which is such a cool way to think about a literary magazine.
Well, and we did a sculpture, was this last year?
It's our first
What is that?
inclusive issue.
Yeah,
2 years ago.
2 years ago. And so it's basically
wow.
a set of cards, and which really constrained the poems. So the poems had to be tiny, and
Mhm.
they either had to be, you know, skinny, or they had to be, let's see, there's a longer poem with longer lines, or we could do 2 columns. So it really constrained the design. But what happens is all these cards are notched. And so you can build a little building with them. So they're notched like this, and you can build a little tower out of it. So it's another sort of sculpture piece
Uh-huh.
that we did. But it also, this is challenging because that also means that every poem is separate. So you could look
Right.
at this as a set of bookmarks if you wanted to, but it separates the poem out from, let's say, our logo.
Uh-huh.
It's terrible for branding because it's like when you design a website and you don't say open a new window, and so it replaces the window. So you've sent your
Right.
reader away to
Right.
somewhere else. And so I think all these little design decisions
Mhm.
highlight that even when we're using defaults for design, we are designing, and that is a decision to use the default instead of other options. And we're just into, let's see what happens with using other options.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a curatorial process. And it makes me think of when you go to a museum and you look at the painting, almost everyone will glance at the painting and then pull away and look at the name of the painting and the painter and the year and sort of read the context before going back to the painting. And it seems like what you're asking your readers to do is just read the, just look at the painting, just read the poem, and then you can read the author bio and find out who wrote it. But it's a really interesting way of just putting the emphasis on the work.
And even online, I think we do that to a certain extent because it's, and Claudine can talk better about this, but it's formatted as a PDF, and the contributor's note gets on a different page than the poem, but is attached to that poem. So we don't do the contributor's notes all at the end, but the poem itself doesn't have the author's name on the page with the poem. It precedes, all the author information precedes the work itself. So even that is a different kind of design decision and a focus on the poem. And also we very much think of the online format, even though now we're reading on our phones, which is a different orientation of the page, we are designing with that white space of the landscape orientation of a page, which means that we're not replicating a literary journal page. We're not thinking in those dimensions. And I think that if I weren't working with Claudine, I would be coming from that literary background and think that online was a replication of the printed page, that we're trying to stick as closely to the traditional journal as possible. And we're not doing that. We're starting from a different design place.
Yeah, I just want to, we are all about the experience. So like, not following the branding, and thank goodness we don't put the logo on every single, that kind of safeguarding, making sure that they know who it is. We really leave it up to the experience, so that the combination of reading, of looking at the poems, of doing this thing with the object, and that experience, I feel like is part of our brand, really. It's the thing that it's really a component of our brand. And kindness. So when we moved to web, like I was like, we have to be kind to people, and this is the web. This has to have a certain legibility sequence. You either have to do it very intentionally and do something experimental online, or you accept the constraints of who's reading online, have to download it, they're reading on screen, there's light behind it. So we're always, and we're getting better at this too, because I would say in the beginning of the years, I was like, yeah, I'm going to let go. I'm going to just do something, that I like. And when I look back and I see my 8-point font, I cringe at the unkindness. We did this one issue where it was on transparent stock. So you could kind of see the image and the text on the behind the other. And so I thought it was very cool how they interacted. But looking back, there's an unkindness about the readability of that. So we always kind of sort of walk this balance. And I think we're getting much better at achieving both. At having an experience, but also being able to be accessible.
Yeah.
And I think that I've got that issue here too. So you can sort of, see
self-indulgence.
But you can see that.
Oh yeah.
You can see the text on the reverse page. And even though I agree that it has an unkindness built in, to me that also, so I don't have low vision. And so it's not, I can read it, but I know it's difficult to read. So I think that making readers aware that they're reading and that they have to work to read, I think that's part of the experiment also. And that it's not the same reading experience for everyone, and that it's not the same reading experience every time.
Yeah, and your magazine, it's one of the few I've seen actually that also pays special attention to readers with visual challenges. So can you talk about why that was important to you and how you incorporate that into the product?
I'll turn it over to Claudine in just a minute, but I will say that as she indicated, we weren't thinking about that from the get-go. And really in 2019, when the university said, we've already stopped supporting the platform that you've been working on, change fast. We paused and said, okay, what does this really mean? How can we redo the project? So 2019, we did this issue, which is probably the visually most challenging because the text shines through the page. And we did not produce any online issues that year. Instead, we had an MFA student update our entire archive of PDFs for e-reader accessibility. And going through that taught us how bad we were at it. And so I'll turn it over to Claudine to talk about how we developed the low vision standards we're using.
Yeah, that was a super humbling moment. That's when because that issue that with the noise coming behind on the vellum was so, I love the noise, and it is a reading experience, and we were really pushing it. But when that happened, it was humbling because I had never thought about it in my own work as well. And just a side note, I work, my other side is I do evacuation for public facing evacuation information for like FEMA and for emergency management. I do mapping as a translator between the scientific community and then regular us, like in emergencies. So working in that field, and even for FEMA, seeing not the neglect, but the afterthought of inclusion, that together has caused a huge shift in my creative scholarship, like huge. I'm teaching a class called Disability, Accessibility, and Design for the first time to my undergrads this semester. So now I can't stop thinking about it. So the next issue we were looking at Braille, and we worked with the Blind Institute in Anaheim. We really started to commit to that we don't have to compromise the experience, that we can actually give this experience equity to different, the visual impairment. We started with low vision standards because we're still learning as we're going. I'm there's something called 508 compliance. So I'm just learning that as my new skill set as a designer. And so every issue is going to build up on that. We added audio to our website as a requirement. Before it was an option, but now it's a requirement. So every little step, with each humbling moment, I think, and learning, we're just adding to that. And the one thing too is, it is super important to not make it a different experience. Like, oh, and then they say this a lot, the alternative format, which is appropriately termed, but we think we can achieve both. We think, so when I see my design students are like, oh my gosh, that type is so big, because they're not used to that 14-point size as a minimum. But we merge it. We don't say, oh, by the way, click here if you have, a visual impairment, or you need, we try to put it all together, and that it is possible to have that equitable experience with a project.
And I will just add that personally, I had production experience, so I sort of understood tags and different styles and stuff, but I was not using styles in Word when I created documents. So when I bolded a title, it didn't read as a title. It wasn't tagged as a title. And I don't know how I got through all my years without knowing that Word had those styles and that you're supposed to use them in every single document. And I think most people don't know that. And so one of the things that I've now built into the introductory MFA course, the Aspects of a Writer course, is training in how to use styles in Word so that all our documents are accessible, are reader friendly, that you can tell when a thing is a subheading if you're using an e-reader. And I think that's something that I would like to push out to the whole literary community. We're all word processing, we're all formatting and laying out our documents now because computers have gotten so sophisticated, and yet we are not actually doing the accessibility layer.
So interesting, because it seems like you guys keep encountering these challenges and then adapting to them. And it's exciting because it's sort of what we were talking about before. You're not having like a one-off issue for visual challenges. This is baked into the aesthetic of your magazine, and you're learning how to kind of incorporate these issues in a creative way.
And I think other little things we've done, last year we instituted parenthetical pronouns in all our contributors' notes. And that little change, I think, signals a welcoming that we thought we had, but unless you signal it, who's to know? So I think every little change, and we really do use each new volume to think about what changes we want to make and how we make this a stronger, more accessible, more inclusive project. And there's a long way to go, but I think that we have set up a structure where we can make specific steps every single year.
And you mentioned themes that emerge in each issue. I'm curious if you announce the themes when you put out a call for submissions, or you just see what comes through and you sort of create the theme as you go?
It's a little bit of both. For the print issue, Claudine and I talk about the theme, and then when I solicit work for that, I try to articulate it in the broadest terms, in part because the design constraints are firm. So if we've got this size to work with and we're using 14-point font, then the size of the poem is make it or break it, right? And then the theme is sort of secondary. But we also, for the online issues especially, the themes emerge, and maybe Claudine and I are the only ones who know what the theme is.
Do you have a sense of what the design is going to be before it, or do you get all the submissions and then you create sort of a theme and a design around the particular batch of poems and other work that you want to publish?
You know, I tell Anna, this is the scare. In typical, you know, the way I train my students in graphic design is like, you have the problem, you have the client, you do thumbnail, you know, there's a certain process. If I can relate anything to this process, it's like painting. And we inform each other. We're informed by the authors. We're informed. It's just, and every time you get informed, you make these decisions. And in the end, it's like, that's why it's a little bit of everything. And at the last second, you might have a stroke that you put, and you're like, oh, that was genius. And it is these scary, every year for 10 years, my heart races. It's, you know, it's, you just, the theme isn't like, we're doing this, and how easy would it be just to plug it in? But it's really this sort of organic flow between Anna and I, between the authors. Sometimes I'm in direct contact with the authors saying, is this okay? Is this pushing it too far? You know, and it's this amazing synergy of creatives, but also not a clear path, but the path has always delivered in the end. And that's why I trust in this process so much. And it truly is some of my best work because it's not so controlled, right? So not methodical.
So is the anxiety that you feel that it might fail, or that you may not pull, the pieces won't come together in the end, or there's going to be some printing problem, or some writer's going to get angry, or what?
We've had plenty. So yes, all of the above. And there's I think almost every issue, there's always been some, maybe not every issue, but some hiccup, something that went wrong, especially like printing. And there was one, it's that map one that happened. We got it off the press, and this weird glitches happened in the middle of poems where they would repeat words. I'm so sorry, my puppy. We got this print and we're like, oh my gosh, we can't send this out. And what this makes, so we're still in the organic sort of merging and brainstorming. We ended up taking leather belt hole punchers that have like a little hole punch, and hole punching the repeated letters. And so there's that hands-on tactile, I think we had 700, we had students involved, and we just hammered these holes, and it became the little swish at the end that made it genius. It's still my favorite part of that issue, of how we handle these mishaps. And it has happened a lot. I want to say a lot, but maybe I'm just traumatized. But it's happened.
That was brilliant, though. We were devastated when we got it and opened it up, because we had both gone through proofs, and you know, but by the time we see final proofs, we've seen it so much we're not seeing it anymore. But putting holes in the map was brilliant given the content and what we were trying to do with space.
So you guys have a submission period coming up. Is there anything in particular that you want to see more of?
Well, I will say that technically we're open all year round, but we do close submissions to catch up. And so we're reopening submissions on February 1st. And I think we just want to see a wider and wider swath of voices. I think there are voices that we have not been publishing and that we very much would like to see. And we're going to work with the contributing editors on engagement of specific audiences and communities of writers. But I would say read around in tab, and if you see something like we've published, then submit. And if you see nothing like we've published, submit. Because I think whenever we come across something and it's like, oh, we have never done anything like that before, what happens to our aesthetic if we go with that? I think that I would also say that there are some mostly white men who, as soon as they're rejected, send out again. And so I just want to encourage everybody who does not identify as a white man to not necessarily send right back, but don't wait 2 years before you resubmit. And especially if we've said, you know, this came close, or we encourage you to submit again in the future, that's a different rejection. That really is encouragement. And so if you've got something in 4 weeks or 6 weeks, send it again. So that's, I think, when in doubt, submit. So when you're rejected, look at the note, and this is true of TAB, but elsewhere too, and don't wait too long before you submit again.
That's great advice. And so what else is on the horizon for you guys? You have an issue coming out very soon.
So the print issue will get mailed probably early next week. And if there are any poets out there teaching and want copies for their classes, we usually have extras so that we can send a batch for teaching purposes, or librarians. We have a couple of librarians who write to us and we send them copies for educational purposes. And we'll do that for free. We don't charge a submission fee. We don't charge for reading. I think both Claudine and I very much believe that universities in the United States have a responsibility for knowledge creation. That's what we're here for. Education, yes, but also, you know, we're the hub of knowledge creation in this country. So I think we want, you know, easy access for submission and easy access for reading this kind of work.
And maybe not just poetry teachers, but visual art teachers as well might reach out.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Very good. So, and people can find you online at tabjournal.com.
.org. I think we also
.org.
have .com, and it'll shoot you right over to .org.
And on Twitter with your fancy new communications.
Yes, Twitter, we're at Tab Journal. And then we're also on Facebook. We have talked about Instagram, and it makes sense because we're so visual oriented. But I think we need to make sure that we're building methodically and figure out one thing well. We'd rather do a few things well than many things not as well.
Makes sense. Well, thank you guys so much. I hope you find just a broader audience. I think this project is ridiculously cool. So I hope this video helps get the word out, and everybody should submit. And thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who came out today.
Yes,
thank you so much.